So a couple of months ago, I had made this first video um, about the captatio benevolentia, and I had been explaining a little bit what it meant, and 2 months elapsed because it took me 2 months to kind of hone down on how long you can actually record a YouTube video before YouTube tells you you cannot upload that video because it's too long. So now that I know I'm back here and doing something else that's not that we're talking about rhetorical devices like captatio benevolentia, which I'd explain is that strategy that you use to kind of downplay what you're gonna say, hoping to get on the good graces of your audience or your reader, hoping that they'll be patient and benevolent with you. And another good rhetorical strategy is to recap whatever you said on the last paragraph, last chapter, last video, or last whatever, last class, whatever you were doing, you recap so that you can retake from there and move on. And what I had been talking about in that first video was about this, how this was going to start in medias res, which is in the middle of things, and it's when you take that a story in the middle of the action in a good point so that you can kind of get the reader or the audience hooked on what's going on in your story with the hopes that then they will continue reading on, and then you can go to the classical flashback in and go back to the beginning of the story. That's not really the in medias res that's going on here. The reason that I'm starting in medias res is because I'm literally in the middle of my dissertation. In the previous video, I was struggling and I had started these videos because I got stuck at the end of trying to finish chapter 2. And now I've finished chapter 2. And this is literally the middle of my research. So we're starting in medias res because I'm literally in the halfway through my dissertation. But curiously, the in medias res is actually the chronological beginning of Western sound studies. Why did I end up there? Because when I got stuck on something very concrete. I was going through sources and scholarly research regarding what theories about sound and its perception were current and accepted in the Middle Ages. And everything I read basically said sound studies in the Middle Ages begin with Aristotle. And everything about sound studies that is current and accepted in the Middle Ages comes from Aristotle. But then I kept finding other things that went completely against what Aristotle said about sound and its perception, or were simply not in keeping with the theories of Aristotle that had been transmitted into the Middle Ages, and that obviously came from other sources, obviously came from Plato, and even before Plato, came from Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans. So I decided I had to go back to the beginning, the chronological beginning. And for Western sound studies, that chronological beginning is Pythagoras. So I want to talk a little bit about Pythagoras, especially because Pythagoras is a very fuzzy historical figure shrouded in legend. And in the Middle Ages, this legend is very powerful, and it lives on into the Renaissance and even the Baroque. And the legend about Pythagoras is very entertaining, and it was even depicted pictorially, like in this very nice representation. This comes from the 15th century treatise on music theory. So we'll talk about a little bit of how this legend of Pythagoras came about. The legend goes that Pythagoras was walking by a blacksmith's shop, and he hears the mallets hitting the anvils. Simultaneously, different mallets are hitting different anvils, and obviously each mallet hitting an anvil issues a different pitch. And he hears them sounding simultaneously, and they sound good together, what we would nowadays call consonant. They were consonant. Back then, they referred to that as concordant. These sounds were concordant. They sounded good together, and Pythagoras wondered why. So the legend goes, so he goes inside the blacksmith shop, starts investigating about the sizes, relative sizes of the mallets and the anvils. Why do I say that this is legend? Because now we know it is not so. If we go back to our nice little picture here, we see that yes, we have him experimental with the mallets and bells and whatnot. This is how it really all began. We don't know if exactly Pythagoras or his successors and disciples, the Pythagoreans. We don't know exactly who said what, but we have a very good idea that of what they said. And what they did, what they started studying were strings. Because they had, the instrument was probably the lyre, which was the most available instrument there. I mean, they noticed that they have different strings of different lengths, and they emit different frequencies, different pitches. And what they discovered was that you have a string, right, that emits a certain pitch. And if you have the same string, same thickness, same tension, exactly half the size, and you pluck it, you get the upper octave of that same pitch. So in a proportion of 2 to 1, it's the equivalent of a musical octave. They discovered then other different proportions. They discovered that if you have a 3 to 2 proportion, that's a perfect fifth, and so on and so forth. They start building, on the basis of these discoveries, the first musical scales. And just to clarify, these first musical scales are not the same as our Western artificial temperate scale to which we're used to, where we have, let's say, C, C sharp, D, or D, D flat, C. And we assume that that D flat or C sharp is the same pitch, and it's actually not. It's two different pitches, two different frequencies, and in the middle of, in between that C and that D, you have quarter tones, you have microtones, you have many other frequencies. So that is the pitches and the frequencies that the Pythagoreans are working with, and on which they base their first scales and start officially the Western music and sound studies. And then later on, we do know that the one that really begins experimenting with iron discs and mallets and other different sound emitting bodies is Archytas, who's also Pythagorean, seems to have been contemporary with Plato, probably moved in the same circles, and who will be very influential. Our Archytas studies will be very influential, not only in music theory and sound theory, but also even in cosmology. The discoveries of the Pythagoreans are going to influence Plato's cosmology, for example, but that will be the subject of a later video. And I just want to conclude this medias res with this little story about Pythagoras, about the beginning of sound studies, and how it all began for Western musical theory and sound studies theory.